this event. We all know that it's difficult with traffic in Manila, and we really appreciate the effort. This is an event that is within the framework of Eskwela, which is our educational program, which we inaugurated 6 months ago, and it consists of public talks like this one, but also seminars for more intimate, even more intimate group, having the pleasure of our guests sharing more in depth the subjects that we are addressing within our program. And just to give you a little bit of an idea of what Eskwela is in terms of the topics that we cover, at the same time we think of Eskwela as a think tank for our own institutional curatorial thinking towards the future. How could we bring all these minds and ideas towards possibly making exhibition programs or commissioning works based on the topics that we are addressing. There are 5 topics in Eskwela. One of them is Asia Pacific in relation to its histories of war and post-war. And this is related to understanding a wider geography of how we understand culture and the arts. And this comes in the context of the Pacific. I think it's an interest that we have in an effort to go a little bit beyond the Southeast Asian regionalism that so often the Philippines is encased in because of post-war and Cold War forms of understanding political structures and world order, the whole ASEAN political formation and all the cultural diplomacy that has come with it's kind of fixed the Philippines specifically to that region. And so this talk and the topic of Asia Pacific is an effort to try to understand other geographies within the Pacific that are close with histories of the Philippines related to colonialism, militarization, and specifically American presence, in this country and in many other places throughout the Pacific. And I won't go through the other topics, not to be so dizzy and blur you with so much information. We have a very nice website which you can go through it. There's 2 guests also at the end of this month that will be more on the performative and choreographic subjects, and we invite you to also participate in those sessions. So, without further ado, I want to present to you Greg Dvorak, who is our guest and our resident. And Greg is an associate professor of international cultural studies at Waseda University in Tokyo, where he is based. His research focuses mainly on themes of militarism, memory, gender, sexuality, the environment, and art between Oceania, particularly Micronesia, Japan, and the United States. Dvorak grew up in Kwajalein Atoll in the Marshall Islands, the largest inhabited coral atoll in the world, and completed his MA at the University of Hawaii and his PhD at the Australian National University with a concentration in Pacific Islands history. He also founded Project Sango, an initiative for fostering awareness about the Pacific in Japan through art and scholarship. So thank you, Greg, for being here and for specifically really thinking of this invitation and making this presentation for us tonight. Thank you.
Do you want me to have that mic?
Sorry.
You can take it home. It'd be fun to have this. I always feel special when I have a mic. So thank you, Inti. Thank you, Jam. Thank you to all of you fabulous people that is on this. I want to offer my thanks to all of you and also the people that have been helping with the residency that I've been in with my partner, Ken, over the past week. We were in Baguio, in Bataan, and now here we are in Manila. it's a short residency, but I'm really exploring these ideas of indigeneity and connections with Pacific places, and all the other stuff that kind of makes this place very relevant, actually, everything else that I already do. So thank you also, Fatima, RJ, Neil, and the others who are helping with this project. First of all, I would like to say Yaboy, which is a Marshallese greeting. It means hello, but it also means I love you. And yo means love. It also means rainbow. And koe means you. So this is similar to the Hawaiian term aloha, but it is with this kind of expression that people greet each other day in and day out. So they like to say that, they are constantly loving. They don't need to think too much about romance and other things. It's always love. It's just pure love. And this is the Marshall Islands, which I'll talk about in a moment. So I'll get there. But today, what I'm going to talk about, and I don't need to sound too academic. This is my sort of nerdy professor voice. The beer helps to kind of make things a little bit more cozy. But basically, I'm going to talk about reframing visual histories of militarism between America and Japan in Oceania. There are a lot of keywords there, thinking about what America is, what Japan is, and what do I mean by Oceania. But the big question is which war? Because often we talk about post-war, as you do in the title that you have here for this series. And yet, for Pacific Islanders, there are many wars. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my background, genealogies that intersect with the stories that I'll be sharing today. I'll talk a bit about Oceania. I'll talk about my idea of amnesia, which I'll get into. We'll talk about a number of wars in relation to visuality and how those wars have been represented or misrepresented or not represented at all. We'll talk about how Pacific Islanders are speaking back through art, but not going too deeply into a whole bunch of contemporary art from the whole region. I'll be focusing especially on Micronesia. And we'll talk a little bit about how we might interface with this here in a transoceanian methodology. So basically, this is how I tend to introduce myself. See, that always works. So that's me wearing the diapers. Don't wear those anymore. But that's me walking along the beach. In the Pacific Islands, it is standard custom to ensure that you really let people connect with your own genealogy. They understand where you're from and why you're from that place and why you're here. So it's very important that I lay that out. I want to point out that I'm not a Pacific Islander. I'm not an indigenous person of the Pacific. My people, I just took a DNA test, so I actually know. Supposedly, I'm from Europe, way, way back. Jewish, Italian, Eastern European roots. And yet, I've lived most of my life in Japan at this point. And I also grew up in the Marshall Islands. And this is a photo of me at the age of 2, or maybe a little younger, on the beaches of the Marshall Islands on this place, which is called Kwajalein Atoll. And this is the main island of Kwajalein, where my father was a missile tester. He was an engineer testing missiles. So I grew up in this world that was very much a Cold War icon. Today it is still a top secret, maybe it's not too secret, but it's a military base. And the whole island itself serves as a military base, but it completely dominates this largest atoll on Earth. So there are 100 islands in this atoll, and that atoll is a part of 26 to 29, depending on how you count them, atolls and islands of the Marshall Islands, which I'll show you in a moment. Now, so this place was sacred Marshallese land for thousands of years. Then it was a Japanese trading post. It became a Japanese military base, a major Japanese military base during World War II. And later it became a Cold War support base for the nuclear tests that happened in the Marshall Islands. And today it's like a cemetery for Japanese war-bereaved people. But it's also a place where little American kids like me grew up, and a place where a lot of Marshallese people also are not allowed to go, because it's a military base. So I'll be talking through this place to some extent to kind of relate these stories to where we are right now. But I should also introduce that one of my first teachers was Bubu, or Netali Kaun. She was maid, and she was actually a chief. She would sing to us in Marshallese, English, and in Japanese. And as I was growing up, I remember hearing her, tell these stories, and she would speak about Japan as if it was very close. And it was very strange because when we were growing up there, this was actually an American base, and it was also part of what was known as the U.S. Trust Territory in the Pacific Islands. So this is a place that, surprisingly, is very close to the Philippines in some ways, but I think I need to unpack it for you to understand how. In the Marshallese language, they use words like zori, which mean sandals in Japanese, to describe flip-flops. They have a lot of Japanese words. There are a lot of things that connect back to World War II. And yet when I went back to this place to do my PhD research, and I began to ask elders, tell me about the war, I would ask them about the tarinai. Tarinai is a word for war in Marshallese. They would say, which war? And this is when I began to wonder, what is this about? Because for them, they counted wars back thousands of years. And that one that happened in the 1940s was actually just a small piece of their larger history. To get into this, I want to talk about what Oceania is and what I mean by that term. And this is also very important because Oceania, art from the Pacific Islands is becoming much more prominent. I think if you just came back from the Pacific Islands, there's a lot more attention being paid in the art world to Oceania, and yet it's largely misunderstood. Oceania consists of 25,000 islands, and they look like this if you put them on a conventional Western map. If you notice, no offense to the Filipinos in the room, but the Philippines is not even on this map. You see, so that whole story that Inti is kind of alluding to, that I think in this country, there tends to be quite an emphasis on Southeast Asia. I think in some ways that also tends to disentangle and disconnect the Philippines from its larger Pacific neighborhood. Because indeed, the Philippines is also a Pacific island in many ways, right? A Pacific archipelago. So, I'll get back to this map, but the thing is, we often use this term Pacific Rim, and that word is very convenient in the Philippines because the Philippines is indeed part of the rim. But the rim is like a big donut with a hole in the middle. And the most delicious parts and the most expensive are the ones that belong to Australia and the United States and New Zealand and Canada, Japan, and the Philippines. Although the Philippines doesn't get the best part of the donut, perhaps. But within that larger conversation, you could say you're part of the rim. But that's what the rim looks like. And you notice that the center is empty. So I want to advocate that we go beyond this and think about what the Pacific Islands really are about. This is why we use the term Oceania. The Marshall Islands are there, just to give you a sense of the location. They're not very far from the Philippines. It only takes a couple hours to fly there, really, about 3 hours maybe, if we took a direct flight, if one existed. But one does not exist, so usually you have to fly to Guam first. Palau is probably the closest nation to the Philippines. And according to the great Tongan scholar Apeli Hauofa, Oceania is a sea of islands. It is a world of people that are connected to each other by the ocean. And so all of us in Oceania today, whether we are indigenous to those islands or otherwise, can truly assert that this sea is our single common heritage. And this is something that we tend to forget when we're fixated on, gigantic islands and GDPs and continents and all this kind of stuff. And Japan wants to be a part of the continent. The Philippines wants to participate in this larger, Asia-Pacific kind of dynamic. But there's actually a lot that gets left out when these kinds of collaborations across the ocean do not happen. So I want to kind of signal some of that and point to some of the causes. And to do that, I use the term amnesia. So, in the Pacific, there are there's land and sea and layers of deep time history. There's so much there, but typically when we talk about the Pacific geographically, this starts as a geography lesson, so to speak. You hear these terms, if you're familiar with the Pacific at all. You hear Polynesia, Melanesia, and Micronesia. But these are extremely colonial terms, just like the word Philippines is. I mean, it's named after, Spanish royalty, right? They're the Marianas, also named after Spanish royalty.
Is there a Filipinesia? What would that look like? And I'm sure there actually is one. I haven't really explored it very much, but we might want to think about that. Is there a Japanesia? Yes, definitely. I mean, there are vestiges of Japan all over the islands. Today, these islands are not colonized literally by Japan, but there is a phantom empire everywhere. You can see Japan everywhere you go in the northern Pacific. In the southern Pacific, no. In the northern Pacific, all across Micronesia, you see Japanese buildings. I played in those buildings as a child. You see, there are countless human remains of soldiers that never returned to Japan, buried, and they're buried here too, in the Philippines, right? So this is very complex and contradictory. This is obvious, but it's so obvious that we tend to forget it. American hegemony is unbelievably powerful in the Northern Pacific and throughout all of Oceania. It's so pervasive in this country that I see it everywhere I go. This may be an independent country, but it's also very fixated on American stuff, on Americanness, on American liberation narratives. And it sounds very much like the way people talk about America in Guam, for example. Places that were briefly occupied by the United States, by Japan, and then, the United States came and took them back. You hear that kind of story. But in other parts of the Pacific, it doesn't sound that way. I would like to argue that this is not just Americanesia, but that it's also amnesia. That there's something to do with America and Japan having their own sort of special sleazy alliance or whatever it is that they're doing with each other that leads to this kind of pervasive amnesia. And so we go back to the famous Japan Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, or the Daitoa Kyoeiken, which was a strong sort of militaristic ideology that emerged in Japan towards the end of the 1930s. And you see this sort of geography that looks very much like, hey, guess what? Asia Pacific. That's just like our Asia Pacific thing today. And it also extends all the way out through the Marshall Islands. You see the Marshall Islands are the far right, the far east sort of edge of that. And the far left goes all the way over the far west, over to Sumatra, for example. But how is that different from this? Because this is I don't know if you've seen this before, this is a Pentagon map. This is the US Department of Defense map of the US command centers throughout the world. The United States has the largest military presence in the world, and this is the way they divide up territory. And if you look at that thing that says US PACCOM, that stands for the US Pacific Command, they divide this map sort of down the middle, so you actually don't get to, if you really think about it, see, PACCOM stretches all the way over here, from that side of the map to this side. It's huge. And the United States military likes to boast that it is the largest expanse of military power in the world. Of course, they call it defensive power. Of course, they refer to this as, security and stuff like that. But in effect, the United States has hegemony throughout this region, that it ensures the flow of goods and services that are beneficial to America and its friends in this region. And that affects all of the Pacific. And of course, it also affects the Philippines in a very big way. And of course, if you study Philippine history, like I think many of you have, you know a lot about that. People in Japan tend to be completely oblivious to it for some reason. They don't recognize that they're also under the aegis of American power, even though we have like hundreds of bases across Japan. And this whole PACCOM is controlled out of Hawaii, out of Honolulu, Hawaii. So this is a pretty powerful quote that was said by the scholar Sakai Naoki, or Naoki Sakai if you put it into American order or English order. Evidently, Japanese imperialism was grafted onto American imperialism. And we will remain enslaved to the legacies of past colonialisms in East Asia and Oceania. I added that, but it's the same idea. Unless we are fully aware of the continuity between Japanese and US colonialisms. And to illustrate that, I give you the wedding photo. This is the famous wedding photo. I forget exactly which scholar said that, but this is in Pacific history, we often refer to this as the wedding pic. So this is the special day when Emperor Showa, as we call him in Japan, or Hirohito, kissed and made up with General MacArthur, who, as you know, is a very important figure here, but went on to become the Supreme Allied Commander of Japan. There's a lot behind this photo. This is certainly a very strong, iconic visual representation of the post-war order. The emperor was, of course, coerced into this kind of, he didn't really have a choice. MacArthur stands there with his hands on his hips, very sort of casual, while the emperor is very formal. But there's this sense that there is now a union between the two. And this is something that I could go on in great detail about, but I won't talk about it right now. But there's a sense of this kind of collusion between Japan and the United States that's actually quite mutually compatible and mutually beneficial. Except usually on the surface, we only see the American side of things. Neferti Tadiar, who's a scholar who has Filipino roots, goes on to say that the Pacific is like a baby with a Japanese mother, an American father, an Australian midwife, and a Filipino mistress. This relationship masks as well as reveals the particular global desires and tensions that are still at play in the free world. I'll let you unpack that. But, she's pointing out this sense of, triangulation between these places. And I think the point of masking as well as revealing is quite important. But that gets into my deeper point about amnesia. There's a lot of forgetting going on. A lot of forgetting that is necessary in order to maintain this kind of world order. But it's that kind of forgetting that also creates divisions between the kinds of cultural conversations and healing, decolonizing kinds of demilitarizing conversations we could be having. But there are bridges that are burnt. So we have Filipino, laborers going to Palau, for example, but they don't get to engage in this kind of cultural and intellectual discourse. They are also resented in Palau because there's so little understanding about these dynamics. There are all kinds of things that are blocking this. It has a lot to do with this kind of elephant in the living room. But to get back to the point about which war, this is what Marshallese people would typically say, and other Micronesians too. So my boo-boo, the Marshallese grandmother, boo-boo means grandmother, I didn't quite say that. So she was like a grandmother to me. She would sing songs to me, and she was our maid, but she took very good care of us. And she would share everything she knew. And when I went back to the Marshall Islands in 2005, I guess, because I'd been away for a very long time, growing up in New Jersey and then in Japan, and then I go back to the Marshall Islands and I find Boo-Boo in her house, and she remembers me. And she starts telling me a story right away. She's like, oh, you came to do this research. Well, let me tell you my story. That story actually, part of it became my book. Here's a plug. So, but anyway, she basically started way, way, way back. She basically said, oh, you want to know about our history? She said, well, in the beginning, there were two men. So actually, there are two men. So these two men, and they're both chiefs, and they're both brothers, and they both go their separate ways, and they fight at some point, and there's the first war, right? And they're fighting over this land, and then the mother gives them pieces of land, but eventually they kill each other, and this other person comes along with a gun, and I'm like, where did the gun come from? And she's like, no, the gun came from a Western ship. And it's like, it seems, in my mind, it seems like it's all over the place, But she talked for 4 or 5 days, and I kept going back, and she kept continuing the story. And finally, she got up to 1970 something. But before then, I guess it was like somewhere in the 1920s, she said, and then I was born. And when she got to 1975, she said, and that's when I met you, and you became my grandson. So I realized that I was a part of this larger genealogy, but there were all these wars, all these battles that were fought. And this has to do with wayfinding. It has to do with trying to find your way through these islands. I mean, I don't want to go into too much detail, but just to point out that the people of Oceania have vast, vast knowledge of the ocean. Incredible knowledge of the ocean. And much can be learned simply by thinking about how they got to these islands. This is an outrigger canoe from the Marshall Islands, but you see all different kinds of canoes like this that travel thousands and thousands of miles. And if we look at a map, you get a sense of the land bridge into Australia that was about 40,000 to up to 80,000 years ago. That's a really long time ago. People were able to walk at one point. These are the people that eventually became known as the Aboriginal people of Australia. And later, this is where the Philippines comes in, because the people who traveled down through what is now Taiwan and the Philippines were the Austronesian people. They're not just past tense. They exist today, except they're largely marginalized in this country, respectfully referred to as indigenous people, disrespectfully referred to as negritos. We were just in the museum today, in the National Museum of Anthropology, and a guide was actually telling school children, yes, they were all short and black. So, what do we do with that? Austronesian migrations into New Guinea, Vanuatu, and Solomons happened around 4,000 plus years ago. You were just in Vanuatu, and so that's a place where people have been settling for a very, very long time. They start developing all kinds of maritime technology to go further and further through these islands, and they fight along the way. Not big, savage, crazy, horrible fights. This is simple fighting about land, about resources, about children, about property, stuff you fight about. Typhoons devastating one place, leading people to leave and move to another place. And they left behind shards of this lapita pottery in places like Vanuatu, like Tonga. The first lapita pottery was found in New Caledonia. These are these dentate patterned, very elaborate sort of pots. They would encode their knowledge in weaving and in lashing. For example, this is La Lava lashing by an artist named Felipe Tohi. And that lashing is the lashing that they would use to tie together a canoe, but it was also the same lashing that they would use to build a house. So the vaka, or the canoe, gets flipped over and becomes the house, becomes the roof of the house, the big voyaging canoe, and then that lashing puts it together. And you see these kinds of buildings all over Tonga and in Samoa and different parts of southern Polynesia. But the interesting thing about what Felipe Tohi also teaches us is that as he's doing this work, he discovered that this is actually code. This stuff, like over and under, but also the different colors that they would use, the different intricacies of those weaves, would have quite intricate mathematical knowledge encoded in it about navigation, about where to go, about genealogies, and so forth. Next to that is a Marshallese mat, or a jahien, which is a very precious, very, very precious sacred object. They're only being revitalized now. This has been largely under practice for many years. Tattooing. This is a photo by the artist Greg Semu, who's Samoan. Tattooing also is a continuation of those patterns and encoding of genealogies. You're considered to be naked if you don't have a tattoo in many places in the Pacific. And so they went on 3,500 years ago to Samoa, Fiji, Tonga, up to northern Oceania. This is where they entered Micronesia. And there were more people that came across from what is now the Philippines, where we are today. And then there's this weird thing that happens where people move up to Hawaii and down to eastern and over to eastern Oceania, out to Rapa Nui, which is a colony of Chile, for example, down to New Zealand, which is known as Aotearoa, properly. And they spread out throughout this entire... This is a massive migration. And this is what we always talk about when we talk about Pacific studies and Pacific histories. I don't want to bore you with this, but I think it's really important to understand that this is a huge, deep time history. This is so, so, so big that when we talk about the war, which was only 75 years ago, they're like, so? I mean, there was like serious trauma of the war. But the thing is, like, how many of you, I mean, I certainly can't do this, how many of you can trace back to your great, 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 great grandmother? I can't, but many Pacific Islanders actually can. They sit there and they do that. It's like, it's almost a pastime. It's like, how well can you recite your genealogy? And the genealogies get way back into this stuff. And they tie into very important, pervasive, powerful legends and stories. This is just an arbitrary thing that some guy came up with. Because These cultural divisions, they spoke similar languages. There are some reasons for there to be a Polynesian. If Polynesia was the last settled place in the Pacific, the people of Polynesia speak a very similar language. Whether you're in Hawaii or all the way down in New Zealand, you can speak a similar language. Maori and Hawaii is almost intelligible, those two languages. However, Melanesia and Micronesia were settled much, much, much earlier, so the languages have diverged incredibly. However, you find a lot of words that are exactly the same. I was just in Baguio, and they were talking about their houses, and they were calling them bale. But in Samoa, the same thing is called a fale. So there are all these roots that you find linguistically, you find all these different kinds of codes, you find stuff that is really similar. I don't want to oversimplify and overgeneralize, but these are the same people, and they are alive. They're alive. It's the other thing about the National Museum. Great museum, but after the guy said, these people are short and black, he said, and here are their bones. You see, this is the typical thing though. You see that so much, it's so predictable. It's a very predictable sort of narrative that I see repeated again and again and again. So how about the 500-year war? It's been going on for 500 years. Trespassers. Because, you know this guy. Magellan. In 1521, he crossed this great ocean, and he was such a bad navigator that he didn't find land anywhere. He didn't, that's the thing, he didn't find it. So they were starving. They were really lucky because they didn't bump into any storms, any typhoons, anything. They created all hell in South America. But then once they got into this ocean, they didn't see anything. So he's like, this is like the Mar Pacifico. It's Pacifico, it's peaceful, it's boring, it's empty. What a terrible place. It's not a romantic word. He meant it in a very negative sense. Really. And so, you know about this. I love this thing in Bataan. You've seen this in Bataan? So this is like by the War Memorial, right? It's above that thing. So like if you go to the War Memorial, they have this like, they have Lapu-Lapu standing on Magellan. That's actually Magellan. He's being squished. That's his head, and he's like all like, the depth and the perspective is a little funky, but you know, you can get a picture. So, and that's like a really big thing. And I had the wonderful coincidental, or maybe fate, destiny moment of actually getting to be Magellan yesterday at Las Casas in Bataan. I was literally, we were just about to have lunch and they were like, it's time for Magellan to get killed. And I was like, no way! So there's like Lapu-Lapu, you've got the indigenous people, you've got the Spaniards, and me. And there we are. But see, there's another story. You guys are missing something. There's another story before that. Before he got here, he went to this place called Guahan. Guahan. Guahan is what we know today as Guam. Although he referred to it as the islands of the thieves, ladrones. The reason why is because Magellan, this is actually, okay, so wait, let me backtrack, hold on a second, I'll show you. This is Umatak village. This is where he landed after crossing the Pacific, which he named the Pacific, for many, many months, or whatever, however long it took. It took them weeks at least to get there. And they were all starving, and they pull up in this place, and it's the first land they've seen in a really long time. And the people come out to greet the boat because they've never seen such a huge ship. They start climbing on board. As an act probably of greeting, some people were threatened, some people were not. I usually do this with my students actually. I ask them to say like, if you are the type of person that would get on the UFO, if it landed right now outside, you know, like if it landed outside like the Outpost, would you get in the UFO or would you like run and like jump out the windows and like get as far away? It's really interesting. There's always like an enclave of like there's a small group of maybe, you know, if it's a room of 100 people, usually we have about 20 people that want to get on the spaceship. And then you have like another, maybe, there may be 50 people that are ready to like run for the hills. And then there are these people in the middle that just sort of like wait and see people. I think that's a pretty common human thing. So this is what was probably happening. So you have these people that go out and they get on the boat, and they're all clamoring on board. What happens is they start pulling at these metal pieces that are on the armor and on the, the clothing of Magellan and his people. And the Spanish are pissed off. They're really freaked out by this. So they get very angry, and Magellan says, "We gotta go burn their village." As you do, because like every time. So it's like, let's burn the village. So they go, they burn this village. They actually burn this village. And so I find it really funny that like, they have this bar called the responsibility matters. But anyway. So these kids are Chamorro children. They lead you around the village, and what do you think they tell you? Like, we were asking, there's a whole bunch of these Pacific Islander leaders and teachers and students and artists, and we were all in this group there. They were very happy to show us around, wonderful kids. And we said, tell us about the history of this village. And they said, so first Magellan came, and then there was a small battle, and then the first church was built right here. And they're standing in front of the church. It was like there was nothing in between them, because this is what's really important, and this is what I hope you get like a takeaway from this conversation. When we talk about the Pacific Islands, we tend, and even any indigenous group, it's very common to talk about cannibalism. Yeah? People eating people. It's a real common trope. It's a really juicy one too. It's like, oh, they ate people, And Pacific Islanders like to play that up too. But the very first notation, recording of cannibalism in the Pacific was not by Pacific Islanders eating Pacific Islanders or anybody else. It was Magellan's people eating the local people, because when they pulled up here, they were starving. And they were sick. And back in those days, in the 1500s, when you were very ill, you didn't reach for like cold medicine or vitamins. You ate the intestines of a pig or a goat. And if you want to look it up, it's in Pigafetta's, whole chronicle of that crossing. And he actually says, several of our men were very sick, and they begged our captain to bring them the entrails of 6 or 7 men so that they could eat them to feel healthy again, and that's what they did. So that's the first recorded incidence in European history of cannibalism. It's not local people, it's Magellan. So good job for killing him. What a nasty guy. And then this guy comes along. I mean, there were hundreds of them. I'm not going to go into all of it, but it's just really important to understand this history in order to understand the present tense. Captain Cook, very important person who was doing more scientific exploration. He stole a lot of stuff. He went around, he stole a lot of beautiful things from Polynesian places, but they also had some exchanges. There were many positive things that came out of it, but by and large, he's the one who is credited with discovering Hawaii, discovering New Zealand, discovering Australia, and look at what happened. Yeah, I mean, these are places that were completely devastated. All kinds of diseases, smallpox, venereal diseases, all kinds of things have overcome those islands, and it's only now that indigenous people are able to really gain enough human rights to even speak out. That's been a really long time. That's like, this is over that's during that 500-year war. And they killed him too, in Hawaii. Captain Cook was killed in 1779, and there were good reasons for that. And I won't go into that. There was a Japanese Captain Cook too. His name was Suzuki Keikun. He didn't go around, they didn't kill him, but he went to the Marshall Islands and he painted this sort of Japanesque watercolor. And shortly after that, Japan began to colonize the northern part of Oceania. So what we call Micronesia today was pretty much completely dominated by Japan as of 1914. And formally in 1922, the League of Nations, which is the forerunner to the United Nations, established a mandate for these islands for Japan. So Japan actually formally had the permission, so to speak, from the international community to colonize these islands. Now whether that's good or bad, The point is, this was a civilian enterprise. It was not a military project. And so that's an important thing to point out, because here in the Philippines, this is a place that was, colonized, but relatively briefly by Japan, and invaded forcefully in a military, overtaking that began at the same time that Pearl Harbor did, for example, in 1941. This is 30 years. And so in those 30 years, Marshall Islanders and other people throughout Micronesia had a very strong experience of this thing. They were also colonized by Germany for a while, European dress, followed by all of these Japanese settlers that came, even children. And in some places, the Japanese and Okinawan colonists overtook the local population, so there were huge numbers of Japanese in Palau and in Saipan. There were over 40,000 people from Japan, including Koreans as well. Koreans who were also mixed into that because Korea was a part of Japan, been annexed by Japan. And they built hospitals, and they did dentistry, and they did worthy things that a lot of Pacific Islanders feel very, very fondly about. They're very positive about this. That doesn't mean that they were totally pro-Japan. It just means that many of their fathers were Japanese, and it means that many of them loved Japanese people. They spoke Japanese. And Japanese were not perceived as violent people. They were perceived as fellow islanders in a strange way, because they practiced a lot of the similar customs. They also ate the same kind of thing. They ate fish. There were a lot of things that they had in common. Now, I've said similar things, by the way, in Japan, and all the right-wing people come to my talks, and they get all excited, and they're like, wow, see, Japan's amazing. And they try to use my words, and they try to twist them around, so that is not what I'm saying, in case there are any right-wing, Japanese people here. So please, get that straight. However, this is ambivalent, it's complex. You can't just talk about it bad. You can't label a whole people or their history that way. And this is very much a complex story. This is more recent work that was made in 2009 by the WAB Collective, which is a group of contemporary artists in Palau, and they're reflecting on that Japanese history of education and discipline in the schools. This is from 1941. This is a board game that was being played by children in Japan. It's a bit too much to decode right now, but basically there's all kinds of interesting sort of ethno-kitsch in it. But it represents to me sort of that journey that Japan had that was very kind of Boy Scout-like. It was very much about looking at the Pacific as a project of development, doing good things, going around, harvesting copra, and then, playing with natives and turning over turtles and that kind of thing. But it ends up in the very middle. At the end of the game, you reach the middle, and you arrive at Nanyo Jinja, which is a major Japanese shrine that was built in Palau in the early 1940s. It was an extremely nationalistic symbol, and also was meant to be a call to militarism in these islands. And indeed, the most common, most popular cartoon in the 1930s in Japan was by far Boken Dankichi. I didn't write the English there, but it's Boken Dankichi, which means Dankichi the Adventurous. And he's a little Tantan guy, basically. This was serialized for 10 years in Japan. Every little boy read this, if not every kid. And you can tell, basically, that it's pretty racist. He numbered all the natives because he can't remember their names. The natives have all kinds of other ethnographic trappings, like, neck rings around their necks, grass skirts. They all look like monkeys. They're all men. And he has a wristwatch and shoes, even though he's gone native otherwise. So Dankichi is basically the little boy empire, the boy emperor who has his boy empire in the Pacific. And he's basically saying, 1, 2, 1, 2, he's marching. So I want to argue that, okay, maybe there was a Pacific War, but these were Pacific Wars. Because in each place, the story is extremely different. If we talk about Northern Oceania again, this area, stretching from the Marshall Islands across the Northern Mariana Islands, the Federated States of Micronesia, Palau, Yap, all of that area that's very close to the Philippines was actually mostly a Japanese territory that was turned into an American territory. And so when the Americans came, they were not all that happy about it. They were quite scared of the Americans. They all spoke Japanese, they didn't speak in English. Only a few of them who had studied Christianity or who were pastors could speak English. Meanwhile, this is where the Philippines comes into the picture. The Japanese military occupations between 1941 to 1945. And this is a larger story that reaches out into Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, Nauru, these places in the Pacific, Hawaii. Hawaii was never annexed under Japanese rule, but if you talk to people in any of those areas, you'll find that they actually have a lot more to say to people in the Philippines. You'll have a conversation about being colonized and then being liberated. And yet, if you go into that area that's all in red, they don't talk that way. And you can see a very big difference between, for example, Guam and Saipan, which are both in the Mariana Islands, which Magellan went to. And Saipan, which was colonized by Japan, is very Japanophile. They eat Japanese food, they love Japanese stuff, they talk nostalgically about this time, and the people in Guam talk very bitterly about it. So it's an interesting kind of complexity and contrast, but it all has to do with militarism. It all gets back to this thing. What is war? I won't try to ponder that or answer that question. But beginning in the early 1940s, droves and droves, tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers were sent into this area that we call Oceania. And most of them never went home. And I don't mean to get all nostalgic and, sad about that. It's quite an emotional thing for many people in Japan. But the reality of it is that shapes the way all these things fit in the way we talk about Asia Pacific today. Because Asia Pacific always seems to leave out these islands. It's very interesting. There's certain places that are included in that story of Asia Pacific, and certain places that are not at all. They're completely neglected. Why? What's going on? And you'll notice that people who have ties to funding in Japan will strategically avoid talking about these particular islands or funding projects that involve that stuff in certain ways. There are a lot of questions that remain unasked, if not unanswered. Instead, we see images like this. And one of my workshops that I'll be having in a couple of days, we'll talk a bit more about these kinds of war photographs from the National Archives, for example, and how to read them, to think about how we might make new meanings out of these images. Because you can look at this image, and you can see, these tired, brave, whatever, American soldiers. No disrespect to them. Because these are people who also, they were forced into a war that they didn't want to be fighting. But they're holding a Japanese flag, aren't they? Right? And if you can read Japanese, do you notice anything about this flag that's unusual? It's upside down. So they don't even know how to hold the flag. The reason it's upside down, we can tell it's upside down, is because all the writing is upside down. Now, why are people writing on a flag? Japanese wrote on flags as good luck charms and as get home safe messages. This totally betrays the narrative of the kamikaze fighter, the suicide pilot, the suicidal blah blah blah, the maniac. That's not what Japanese young men were going into. They wanted to get home, of course. They were not just dying for the emperor. They wanted to go home. And these messages were messages from their loved ones, from their mothers, from their fathers, from their families. So that flag represents one person, and his name is Oki Kiyoshi. It says it right on the flag. These guys don't even see that. So what happens when we begin to unpack these stories, even historically, looking at archives, thinking about this stuff more deeply? And what do we make of this image? Here are the Marshall Islanders. It's a rather gruesome image, but trust me, there are many more gruesome images in the archives. I went through 3,500 images doing my PhD research and eventually the report that I did for this book. But, here are the Marshall Islanders who spoke Japanese, who knew these people personally, being forced to bury that whole empire physically, tangibly, with their own bodies and also with their own minds, being asked to put that away and forget about it. This is where those Japanese bones remain throughout the Pacific, including here in the Philippines, in these bomb craters and places like that, where they were buried in mass graves. So it's not to be, again, nationalistic about that from the Japanese perspective, or to be nostalgic. It's just simply that these are the raw details of war, And then this is how the US begins to clean up the image. You know, these PR shots, giving cigarettes. Yeah, I mean, this whole guy's land has been, he's a chief, apparently. We don't know what his name is. They say that his name was Magellan, this thing, but we don't know of such a person. You know, these gestures of friendship, of goodwill. And by 1944, you start seeing images like this. And then there's this long expanse of time. This area that we call the Cold War, a period of nuclear testing that we'll talk about in a moment. And the Marshall Islands, the Federated States of Micronesia, the Republic of Palau become independent nations. Saipan becomes the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas, but they're all still under the aegis of American power. They were allowed to become independent on the condition that they would grant unlimited use of their land for military purposes at any time that the United States pleases, in exchange for defense and also for free passage, unrestricted passage and immigration into the United States. So they can all go to the US if they want and migrate there. And another thing they could do is, hey, they could join the US Army. So, loads and loads of Pacific Islander youth from these parts of former American territories of Micronesia that were taken from Japan and eventually became independent have entered the US Army, and many have died in the Middle East. There's a lot more there to talk about, but you see throughout the Pacific these kinds of Japanese buildings, block houses on people's land that were never cleaned up, that people still use to live in, and they're sort of like an enduring museum. You see kids who play in the craters of bombs. And to them, that's part of the landscape. This is where I grew up. This is my hometown. We did the same thing. And ships at the bottom of the lagoon. I mean, it was cool that doing my PhD, I was allowed to go diving in these ships, but at the same time, you know, I mean, that once you know the people, the children of the families, the children of the fathers who died on these ships, it becomes a different story. So these are intersections of all these different stories. These are bereaved Japanese who are going to visit the graves of their loved ones. They don't want to bring the bones back. They actually just want to go and be there, because to them it's a cemetery. And yet there are these other people, they're what I like to call vigilante memorialists, people who go all around the Pacific hunting for bones, hunting for remains, and they're almost like bounty hunters. They also get money from this, from the Japanese government. So whenever you hear about people going and repatriating bones from the Philippines to Japan, that's actually what's going on. It's a very complicated, very fraught, weird process. People get a lot of money from the Japanese government to go and take these trips, and that money gets laundered into other stuff. And if you can come back with a lot of bones, you can get a lot of money. And at the same time, you also get a lot of glory. You get to present yourself as a wonderful hero of the nation, doing the dirty work that Japan never finished, repatriating all of these souls. This guy is actually a very nice man. We had the opportunity, my partner and I had the opportunity to travel together with him to this island, but he was actually a former Tokotai or kamikaze pilot who never flew his mission, and it was supposed to be here, supposed to be the Philippines. So here's this guy who feels this need to go back and connect, and but at the same time he's also involved in collecting bones and money. It's very, very complex stuff. But at the end of the day, now we commemorate the fallen brave of Micronesia. And it's an ongoing story. In the Marshallese language, poison, or in Marshallese we say poison, means nuclear radiation. So last year in this very same space, there was an excellent exhibition by the artist Bruce Conner, and one of his iconic works is his Crossroads film series, which basically looks at the mushroom cloud of one of the early tests, the Ivy test, and its constant unfolding plumes of horror. It's set to a soundtrack, very chilling, very haunting. But one of my criticisms of his work is basically that we don't sense that people actually had any connection to this place. This is a place that we all know as Bikini. And bikini is not a swimsuit. Bikini was never a swimsuit until some French guy named Louis Réard decided that it was a swimsuit, just because he thought that was a cool name. I mean, like, it's like just a totally random thing. He saw the news about bikini and he was like, wow, that's so explosive, we must make it. So he got all excited and he turned it into this thing. And that's like, you do any search on Google for bikini and you get more bikini swimsuits than you get the actual bikini. This is a sacred homeland to people. The United States tested 67 atomic bombs in the Marshall Islands between 1946 and 1958. 1946, July 1946 is only 1 year after the end of the war. Less than 1 year after the end. So they went right on to the Marshall Islands and continued all this stuff. I work in Japan, I teach in Japan. Most of my students are Japanese and they don't know that. They think they're the only victims of nuclear war. But the Marshallese bore a lot of that weight themselves, a lot of that burden. The United States eventually compensated the people of the Marshall Islands with $150 million, and they made them sign and say, this is the last you'll ever claim, ever, and this is it in all perpetuity. And they didn't quite get that whole gist, and then more information surfaced, and they discovered that more radiation had spread throughout the islands, and the compensation wasn't even enough. Because if you have cancers all over your body, you need treatment for life if you want to stay alive. So it was never enough for these people. $150 million is nothing. We're talking about huge populations of people. It's nothing. The child of nuclear testing is missile testing. And I am a child of missile testing. Because my father was sent to Kwajalein Atoll in the Marshall Islands to test missiles. We didn't have nuclear bombs on those missiles, but those missiles are meant to carry nuclear bombs. So I've seen the end of the world many times. I've seen what that looks like. See the entry of these missiles. This is happening right now. This has been happening since 1964 and it continues to happen today. It's very convenient to the United States that this place is out of sight and out of mind in the middle of the Pacific. You almost never, if you look at CNN and they talk about some missile test from the United States responding to Kim Jong-un, that's where it's coming from. But they never say. They just say, oh, it's someplace in the middle of the Pacific. They don't identify the name. They don't identify the people. The people who have Cold War junk in their backyard. The people who still have a gigantic nuclear waste dump in their backyard. This is the Runit Dome on the island of Runit in Inuitak. There were two places where they tested nuclear bombs. One was in Bikini and one was in an atoll called Inuitak. And this is Inuitak. The people resettled here, the people living just a few islands down from here. And that place, that thing is one of 40 islands in Inuitak Atoll. They named this thing the tomb. Local people refer to it as the tomb. It contains 73,000 cubic meters of radioactive debris, including plutonium-239, which is really horrible stuff. That will be there forever, as long as humanity exists. And with rising tides, just in the last year, as climate change threatens all of these islands as the ocean levels rise, this is leaking. And it's been leaching all kinds of horrible stuff into the environment ever since it was formed anyway. All the Americans who built this thing have died of cancer. Almost all of them. Like hideous cancer. So it's not pretty, I don't mean to like depress you, but this is huge. You see those little dots on that, those are actually people standing on that. You know, what if we called the bathing suit the Hiroshima? Would everybody be okay with that? And just this week, since we've come to the Philippines, this is the latest thing on Facebook. Some crafty hipster millennial brew company, some craft brew people in Dallas, Texas, created a beer called Bikini Atoll. The name of their company is the Manhattan Project Beer Company because they think that's cool. Welcome to the beautiful islands of Bikini. Raspberry, blackberry. So much fun. Tart, salty, crisp. And when the Marshall Islands government rightfully accused them of appropriating their name for their own profit just this last week, They responded by saying, we do this to raise awareness about the Marshall Islands. And then nowhere on their website does it say anything about awareness. In fact, it says, enjoy this by the pool, inspired by summer days by the pool. This is the kind of stuff. This is like SpongeBob SquarePants lives on Bikini Bottom. So all of these popular cultural icons, it's really important to decode them and get it. I find them really fascinating. They're also extremely troubling. And they shed a lot of light on how imperialism works and also how it works in this country, because there's deep connections. I won't go into details, but the next thing, of course, is climate wars. The war against climate change. This is another major one. And so today, people around the Pacific are saying, well, it's better having an irradiated island filled with nuclear waste than having no island at all, because the waters are rising. But I don't mean to paint such a bleak picture. Every time I do this, I impress people. The crazy thing is, my friends from the Pacific, the artists that I work with, my people I consider my family, they're relentlessly optimistic, and so they fight. They fight for dignity, for rights. Not about money, it's about actually stopping this crap. They are on the leading edge of where our world needs to go. They actually succeeded in stopping this coal tanker from leaving the port in Australia several years ago, but of course it was meant to draw attention to this issue. And so, briefly, I want to just talk a little bit about how artists from this region are able to speak back. I'm deliberately avoiding talking about some of this work. This is work by Michael Tufferty, who's an amazing artist. I love him. But he's also from the South Pacific. The South Pacific gets way too much attention. The South Pacific, Samoa, Tonga, Vanuatu, Papua New Guinea, all of these places, very beautiful. They're the ones that get picked up in popular culture. And one of the main reasons why is because the war never went to many of these islands. Papua New Guinea, yes. Part of Vanuatu, yes. Solomon Islands, yes. But most of the rest of the Pacific was barely touched by the war. So, again, it's like this untouched, unspoiled Eden. The Trust territory of the Pacific in the north was considered sort of the rust territory, the paradise that was never worth having in the first place. So, a recent work that we put in the Honolulu Biennial, I was one of the advisors for that, with Fumio Nanjo from the Mori Art Museum in Tokyo, was a video work, I don't have time to show it, by Mickey Davis from Guam. And she really gets to the heart of this Magellan thing and talks about navigation. As I alluded, this isn't a great picture, but fine mat revival has become a really important means of bringing women from all throughout the Marshall Islands, very rural places, to retrace their genealogies and to share this. And these works were also commissioned and put into the Asia Pacific Triennial, this last one that was in Brisbane, Australia, this last year. This is a work by Sam Adobai, and it's a Palau traditional meeting house, but the pillars are all made out of Pepsi cans. And if you look at the very top, you see the atomic blast. This work was actually, it's not a terribly stunning work in some ways, but it's also so powerful that it was censored by the US government back in the 1990s. And if you went to the Venice Biennale, not this year, but the last time, in 2017, you would have seen the work in the New Zealand pavilion. And I do want to talk about this one artist from the South Pacific, Lisa Rehana. She's a friend of mine, and she's an amazing artist, incredible. She basically hijacked this wallpaper that was made by a French artist named Joseph Dufour, which is basically depicting the, les sauvages de la terre. So the savages, but all the savages look like Greek gods, and they're all dancing around and drinking wine and doing happy things because they're just paradise waiting to be plucked by Europeans. So she infects that. I won't go into the meaning of In Pursuit of Venus, but it has to do with a project that Captain Cook was tasked with. So you see all these sorts of scenes of the chief scientist and explorer Joseph Banks getting into trouble, getting tattooed, having sex with natives. You see natives pushing back. You see people. You see the bones of Captain Cook being presented to his British companions when they come back to look for his body. She pulls together all these stories from around Oceania as an act of sort of reappropriating those colonialist messages and that Orientalism. But it's a stunning work, and it's hard to. This scrolls, the scrolling, massive wallpaper that is alive and animated and fascinating, and it runs for about 30 minutes, I think. So it's really worth seeing if you have a chance. I think it's actually in Singapore at the moment. It's in a number of art museums now. And I also want to introduce Kathy Jedno-Kijner and close with her work. Kathy Jedno-Kijner is a Marshall Islander poet, spoken word artist, who addressed the United Nations Global Climate Change Summit in 2014. And she received a major standing ovation from all these world leaders, which is the first time since Nelson Mandela that happened. And she went on to sort of forge out a space as a contemporary artist. And she's emerging more and more as a performance artist who does a lot of these video poems. This was her work in the Honolulu Biennial called Islands Dropped from a Basket. It's a 3-channel video. But in these baskets are all of these sort of Marshallese stories of trauma and resilience. I forgot to mention, she does say, we deserve to do more than just survive, we deserve to thrive. It's a very important point. It's not about victimhood, and it's not just about survival, it's about thriving, it's about perpetuating. So I want to share with you, just to finish, her piece from last year, Anointed, where she actually went to the dome. She went to that nuclear waste dump that they call the tomb, and she stood upon it, and she said these words. Oops.
I'm coming to meet you. I'm coming to see you. What stories will I find? Will I find an island or a tomb? To get to this tomb, take a canoe. Take a canoe through miles of scattered sun. Swallow endless swirling sea. Gulp down radioactive lagoon. Do not bring flowers or speeches. There will be no white stones to scatter along this grave. There will be no songs to sing. How shall we remember you? You were a whole island once. You were breadfruit trees, heavy with green globes of fruit, whispering promises of massive canoes. Crabs dusted with white sand scuttled through pandanus roots. Beneath blooming coconut trees, beds of watermelon slept still, swollen with juice. And you were protected by powerful Eloid chiefs birthed from women who could swim pregnant for miles beneath a full moon. Then you became testing ground. 9 nuclear weapons consumed you, one by one, engulfed in an inferno of blazing heat. You became cratered, an empty belly. Plutonium ground into a concrete slurry filled your hollow caverns. You became tomb. You became concrete shell. You became solidified history. Immovable, unforgettable. You were a whole island once. Who remembers you beyond your death? Who would have us forget that you were once green globes of fruits, pandanus roots, and whispers of canoes? Who knows the stories of the life you led before? Here's the story of a turtle goddess. She gifted one of her sons, Leda, a piece of her shell, anointed with power, a leathery green fragment, hollow as a piece of bark. It gave Leda the power to transform into anything, into houses, the trees, the shapes of other men, even kindling for the first fire, almost burned us alive. trees, a cracked dome, a rising sea, a leaking nuclear waste with no fence. There must be more to this than a concrete shell that houses death. Here's the story of another shell, anointed with power. Leva used it to transform into kindling for the first fire. He gave this fire to a small boy. The boy almost burned his entire village to the ground. Licks of fire leapt from skin and bones, from strands of coconut leaves, while the boy cried without laughed. This is a story of a people on fire. We pretend it is not burning all of us. Here is the story of the ways we've been tricked, the lies we've been fed. It's not poisonous anymore. Your illnesses are normal. You're fine. You're fine. My belly is a crater empty of stories and answers. Only questions. Hard as concrete. Who gave them this power? Who anointed them with the power to burn?
Okay, that goes on for a little bit. Yeah, so the people of Eniwetok, I mean, she goes on to share that, but still live there. And part of the package with the U.S. is basically that they, in order to get the money, they had to go back. And they were told it was safe, and now they know otherwise, but it's too late. A lot of these kinds of stories. But again, it's not about victimhood, as dark as it may seem. It's about resilience. And so I often look to the metaphor of coral. It's the title of my book, Coral and Concrete. It's about the resilience of coral. Yes, coral is bleaching. Yes, coral is dying. It's true. But the substance of coral is about spawning. Coral is alive. That's coral spawning. And I believe that each of us is in some way, through the art that we create, through the messages that we share, through the culture that we expand and bring back and forth with us, we are each like those little coral polyps. And together we build a reef. So this is my idea of Transoceania. And I believe it's really important that we cultivate these conversations between places that are not, in the metropolitan spotlight. These places that are, trans-colonial, trans-marginal, and to really think about what that means. So I wish I had more copies of this to share. I don't mean to plug the book too much, but I do go into that in some detail. This is my book, Coral and Concrete, and it talks very much about these different layers of history in the Marshall Islands, but also meant to think about this as a way of looking at history in the world, and history as now. Obviously, I'm a historian, but at the same time, as I work more and more in spheres of art, I find that actually that's very much needed to convey what Pacific Islanders are all about, and about their art, and about cultivating those conversations. So just a preview, in the two workshops I'll be doing, I'll be talking about demilitarizing the nuclear scape, going more into those nuclear stories, and about ways of doing that, about the way different artists practice that. I'll also be showing a film called Nuclear Savage as a part of that. And on the second day, I'll be talking about post-colonial Transoceanian art and going into sort of a larger survey about different artists from all around the Pacific these days. So, thank you. Komotara.
Thank you so much for this presentation. As I said, as I said at the beginning,
The beginning.
For the effort for putting catering specifically the presentation within the framework of articulation. It's definitely a pleasure to hear you. And also, brought us through different ways of mapping a specific area through different, as you said, deep time history to different waves of colonialism, but at the end showing us how narratives are being self-written, and this artist that he presented at the very end clearly shows that there is like a new form of representation, you know? And it's incredible how art can still be a mechanism, you know, to counter or act all this dominant and colonial and violent moments of history, you know? I think that it's, I mean, the invitation that you made us of going beyond the war that we're connected to in the Philippines, which would be the Second World War, is what we'll be discussing with some of the participants in the seminar. And I don't know, I wanted to know for like this artist that you presented at the end. You said that you've advised the biennial, but are you working on something curatorially to bring this artist together? Like what is, because you, as I just said, you mentioned that it's more been, that's been presented in this other platforms, but I wonder if you're curatorially thinking of something, maybe you could share with us that.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is almost like, it's funny, it's like I have to do this whole talk in order to get to the beginning. That's why when you said beginning, I got all excited, because I was like, that's the beginning. There's so much literacy about the Pacific that, again, it's amnesia, right? So we don't get to that point usually. Right now I'm curating a series of films as part of the Makati International Documentary Film Festival, which are from Oceania, but from particularly this part of Oceania, and it's actually called Amnesia. Islands or archipelagos of, forgotten archipelagos of Oceania. And we're looking specifically at bodies, lands, and crossings that have been silenced. So that's sort of a way of getting into the larger sort of curatorial practice that I'm already in conversation about with a number of other people. So I'm advising the Sapporo International Art Festival. I'm also working with the next Asia Pacific Triennial, APT 10, which is happening in 2021.
We should go.
So please, yeah, because we're actually, so next week I'll be leaving for Micronesia with curators from, I'm actually a co-curator on that, curators from the Queensland Gallery. And we'll be going to the Marshall Islands, to the Federated States of Micronesia, and to Guam for our first trip. But we're trying to find a way of cultivating a conversation that goes beyond the material, because as you yourself would recognize, you've gone to Tonga and Vanuatu, right, and Fiji now, and you recognize they have this very rich material culture. And it's also really interesting, if you look like here in the Philippines, we were up in Baguio, Ifugao and Igorot kind of cultures have this really intense, really cool material thing going on. I mean, these embellished, fascinating sculptures and carvings, but the further you go to other places in the Philippines, these other indigenous groups might not have the same kind of goods. And I find it really interesting how different groups get sort of evaluated for their goodies. Like how good they're, like, oh, these people carve this stuff. And it was really funny because there was this friend, we were staying with Kawai Antigia and Nona Garcia, and they had this neighbor that kind of came by. He was a really nice guy, but he collects all these artifacts. That doesn't sound right. He's a really nice guy, and he collects, and he collects these artifacts. But the thing is, like, we were sitting around drinking, and he starts saying to me, "So tell me about the Marshall Islands. Do they have idols? Do they carve idols?" And I was like, "No, they don't. They don't. Come to think of it, I've never really even thought about it. Like, they don't carve idols. Well, first of all, because they don't have stone. They don't have stone there. These are low-lying atolls. There's no volcano. They don't have wood. They don't have wood that lasts very long. They have very, thin wood that can't be built into too much except for canoes maybe. Do they carve idols? No. Does that mean that their material culture is not sophisticated? Not at all. they deal with the ephemeral, they deal with the unseen. So if you're working from a contemporary art optic, especially that's privileging the visual, and you even say that, it's visualizing, right? I've started with visualizing in my own book. I wrote so much about visual anthropology, visualizing these different things, looking at semiotics. But what about the smells? What about the feelings? What about the sensations? What about the song? What about the ephemeral stuff? So that's kind of what we're trying to get at with what we're doing with APT 10. Trying to find some way of expressing that ephemeral world that seems to be very much also throughout the Pacific, but certainly in northern Oceania, that would otherwise go unnoticed. So that's just a taste. But I'm doing a number of other projects.
I mean, also in terms of non-material culture, the voice here in this last video is quite evident on how poetry, oral history, becomes that material culture.
Exactly.
And maybe before people leave the room, and because some of us are very excited about the conversation, if anyone in the room would like to ask Greg, I think this is he brought us to a broader conversation. I see, I don't want to put you on the spot, but when I hear this last video, the quote, the United Nations, it goes beyond the victimization, and it's the idea of thriving. It's like a human rights condition, which goes through different agendas. It's the agenda here of rights in the Pacific, but it could be also gender rights. It goes. You really feel like that person on top of that shell, like claiming something for to counteract decades, centuries of dehumanization. And please, anybody in the room who would like to contribute, or if you have any questions, this is the right time to maybe, if you want Greg to clarify more, or don't be shy. There. Can you introduce yourself?
I'm Sian.
Hi, Sian. Wow. Nice to meet you.
Okay. Hey, could you talk a little bit more about forms of resistance from the islanders themselves, other than being sort of mediated by from a curatorial positionality, other gestures of decolonization, and what particular issues they confront, and how do they get organized? Do they have organizations and associations, and what forms do their voices take?
Excellent question, and a really important one.
I mean, if ever, I'm interested if there's a particularly islander voice. I don't know exactly what I'm asking, but then I feel like we are islanders, but we don't really think about the idea of an island. More so within the Pacific, further into the Pacific. So I'm interested in that sensibility of being surrounded but connected by water, and how does this play out in their gestures of decolonization.
Okay, so I could go on for a really long time about that. So I'll but to try to keep it really concise, yes, of course. I mean, there are all kinds of islander voices. The only thing is that the Pacific itself, the Oceania itself, is extremely diverse. And so the conversation is not one, but many. And there are different layers of colonization, which sometimes ironically bring people together, and in other ways completely divide them. But I could give this, this is like a piece, tiny little piece of some of the other stuff that I usually talk about in my classes, for example. I'm a professor, so we talk about this a lot, but I don't like to talk on behalf of everybody either. I mean, as much as possible, I tapped into, and I was very fortunate as a graduate student to work in the field of Pacific Island studies before I went on to study history and anthropology at the PhD level. And at the University of Hawaii, thank you, the field of Pacific Island studies is very much Pacific Islander-centered. And it's become that way because it wasn't that way before. It was an extremely colonial, in fact CIA-funded enterprise in the United States. And in Australia, same idea. Australia, DFAT, they're overseas kind of people trying to figure out how to use these islands for their best benefit of security and so forth. So, beginning in the 1970s, the Native Hawaiian sovereignty movement, for example, becomes a very important movement. And they also begin to push back. I mean, it's part of the civil rights movement. It connects with the US civil rights movement. It connects with all issues around gender equality and so forth. All these different kinds of movements coalesce into more and more decolonization movements. In Hawaii, so we have the Native Hawaiian sovereignty movement. In New Zealand, or Aotearoa, Maori indigenous movements that really took off in the 1960s and the 1970s. They began to form alliances across Polynesia. In Micronesia, there was a whole governmental, you see, things like the United States was trying to give the impression that they were fostering democracy. So they were all for trying to get people to form congresses and choose local leaders. The only thing is, like, instead of the actual election process choosing these people, the United States did what the United States is very good at. They took them on tours to Washington. They tried to get these young, promising leaders who had come from prominent families that had Japanese roots, actually, to come to Washington and to get training. So this sort of post-colonial indigenous voice from the Pacific is complicated by a very American inflection in the North and kind of the American model of democracy. And the South Pacific, it's also about resistance to the crown. It's very much, it has a very British feeling to it. Then you also have French territories, which I didn't even mention, also where they had 200 nuclear tests in Motoroa and Whamatafa in Tahiti, around Tahiti. Yeah, in the 90s, that's, well, up until the 80s, but like up until the 90s, they still have these nuclear things. So, like, this is really huge. And so these Pacific voices, sometimes you have to look kind of hard to find, the most extensive writings, for example. But you can look at the work of, for example, Alan Duff from Maori. There's also Pilsoni Haraniko. There are a whole bunch of writers. There's so many writers that come from the Pacific. A lot of scholars. Vince Diaz is one who I think really has a lot of relevance here. Vincent Diaz. He's actually part Filipino as well. Grew up in Guam, but also has ties to Pohnpei. Anyway, I don't want to go on and on. The point is that, yes, there's a whole scholarly tradition actually that's built up around these conversations. And I think one of the most important things that I want to say is that Pacific Islanders are the most globalized people on Earth. They're not living in the past. So they're totally, you can go out to one of these islands in the middle of the Pacific, and someone will come up to you and speak to you as if they're from Missouri. And in other places, they'll speak to you like they're from Paris. In other places, they'll speak to you as if they're from New Zealand. They have the cutest New Zealand accents in the Cook Islands, for example. And in Tonga, right? They have these really strong New Zealand. So the point is, there are voices, and those voices come from a very, very deep place. People are in conversation with their counterparts in other parts of the world. It's just that the rest of the world doesn't listen enough. So if we tune into that, yeah, I can give you a list of a lot of sources. That helps. Yeah, but it's out there, and it's easy to ignore, and it's easy for some people to come up with Pacific Island studies that doesn't include any Pacific Islanders, like in Japan. So a big part of my project, I mean, you're talking about territorial work, but in Japan as well, I'm really trying to push for more of a, Pacific engaged conversation, because it doesn't happen. I belong to a Japanese Pacific Island Studies organization, and every time they have a meeting, there are no Pacific Islanders. It's like 400 Japanese men sitting around, and mostly men. And that's it. That's the Pacific. They're okay with that. You know what I mean? So.
Anybody else? I'm just curious about it. I guess it's more of a recent presence in relation to what we've heard. But have you addressed any subject related to the involvement of China in the Pacific at the moment? Because I know that it's a subject that, well, it is very hot in relation to the Philippines, and it's ceased.
Okay, so I think the best way of talking about this would be to go to Taiwan first. So that basically, as I was saying, there's this migration that happens several thousand years ago of Austronesian people into the Pacific. And China, the nation China, okay, the Beijing, has a lot of involvement throughout the Pacific. The PRC. But, and most Pacific nations have diplomatic relations with Beijing. But Taiwan also pushes very much for being recognized. So Taipei also has relations with many of these Pacific nations, including the Marshall Islands. So they have an embassy in Taipei. That was the first sort of phase of this. Meanwhile, there was a lot of migration of Chinese people, for example, buying passports and moving into places like Tonga and also the Marshall Islands and Samoa. And by buying passports, if you buy the passport, effectively you get the citizenship. And so then you can move to these islands, and once you move to those islands, if you start a business and you raise enough money, you can then take advantage of that country's immigration policies with the United States or with New Zealand. So this became a nice kind of back channel to move into these other places. Chinese businesses are all over the Pacific, and it's not an organized colonial sort of process. It's very much settlers, ordinary people, who mean no harm, but they're also huge Chinese fishing operatives, Taiwanese fishing operatives. But to get back to the Taiwan story, Taiwan recently, you see this a lot in the art world actually, the Taiwanese government is also pushing sort of the story of their Austronesian artists, which is great for them in some ways because it gives them more exposure, but at the same time it's being used also as a diplomatic tool. So it's sort of like, oh look, we have Austronesian artists.
We're not Han.
We are not Han people, yeah. And so you have the funny thing though, that I find very puzzling, is that there are a lot of these Han curators, people who are clearly Chinese and don't have any indigenous roots, saying we are indigenous, we are Austronesians. It happens a lot. They talk about Nandao, they're talking about the southern islands, and they're referring to this Austronesian thing, and they use it as a political chip. And there are many indigenous curators and artists from Taiwan who are now speaking up around that, and especially in conversation with their Pacific counterparts. So, there's a lot of this Pacific Chinese sort of thing going on, but it's not new. There have been many Chinese settlers all over the Pacific, and people who have Chinese roots. So it's not necessarily a big nefarious, evil kind of thing. But there is also a lot of claimed islands, like, around the Philippines, around Japan, and this whole thing with the Diaoyutai Islands, owned by China, and by Taiwan is Diaoyutai, but in Japan they call it the Senkaku Islands. So Tokyo bought those islands, which is weird, because that's my tax money. and the thing is, every single time you look at one of these islands that is like in a contested territory, it's usually not that it was Chinese or Japanese or Taiwanese, but it was actually someone else's land that was already colonized. So like, that's actually Ryukyu. That's Okinawa. That's the Okinawan Ryukyu kingdom that was taken over. So, I think we have to complicate the story.
So I guess, thank you so much for this incredible presentation, and thank you everybody for coming. There's still some seats to be participants of Greg's closed door seminar, so please just come to any of us and let us know if you want to join. It's on Thursday and Friday in the afternoon from 1 to 4. Yeah. So please, thank you. Sorry.
I just want to say, again, thank you so much for listening through all this, 40,000 years of history. It's a lot to take in, I'm sorry. It's rather police. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for inviting me.